Professor Alan Whitman took a slow sip of his coffee as he glanced over his lecture hall. Today was one of those days he enjoyed most, challenging students, testing their limits, exposing intellectual frauds. The university had invited a guest to his advanced calculus class, a so-called visionary billionaire who, in Whitman's opinion, was nothing more than an overhyped businessman. Elon Musk sat among the students, relaxed, wearing his usual smirk. Whitman had always been skeptical of Musk's supposed genius. The media painted him as a tech mogul, an innovator, but Whitman believed real intelligence lay in academia, not corporate boardrooms. "Since we have Mr. Musk here today," Whitman said, his voice carrying a hint of condescension, "perhaps he'd like to solve a problem for us." He turned to the board and quickly scribbled down a brutal calculus equation, one involving triple integrals, vector fields, and a particularly tricky transformation. He stepped back, folding his arms. The room fell silent. A few students exchanged nervous glances, recognizing the challenge. Musk, however, simply stood, adjusted his jacket, and walked to the board with an easy confidence. "Interesting choice," he muttered as he picked up a piece of chalk. Without hesitation, he started writing. The symbols flowed effortlessly from his hand as if he'd memorized them long ago. The first step, a complex substitution, was done in seconds. Then, deftly, he manipulated the integral, breaking it into manageable parts, using a divergence theorem most students hadn't yet encountered. The board filled with precise calculations, and within minutes Musk stepped back. "That should do it," he said casually, setting the chalk down. Whitman's smirk had vanished. He scanned the work, searching for mistakes, but found none. In fact, Musk had solved it with an efficiency that was downright elegant. The students, realizing what had just happened, started murmuring. Some even clapped. Musk turned to Whitman, a playful gleam in his eyes. "I used to do this for fun when I was younger," he said. "Glad to see I haven't lost my touch." Whitman cleared his throat. "Impressive," he muttered, barely masking his embarrassment. Musk grinned, heading back to his seat. "Calculus is fun, but building rockets is more my style," he said, winking at a student. The lecture hall buzzed with excitement. The professor, left speechless, simply moved on to the next topic, his plan to humiliate Musk backfiring spectacularly. As Professor Whitman turned back to the board, his mind raced. He had spent years mastering advanced mathematical concepts, yet here was a billionaire, someone he had dismissed as a mere businessman, effortlessly solving one of his toughest problems. The murmurs in the room hadn't stopped, and Whitman could feel his authority slipping. Determined to regain control, he straightened his posture. "Well, Mr. Musk," he said, his voice regaining some of its usual arrogance, "since you seem to enjoy calculus so much, perhaps you'd like to attempt something more abstract." He quickly sketched out another problem, this time delving into real analysis, a proof involving limits and continuity that would stump even advanced students. Musk leaned back in his seat, studying the board for a moment. Then, with the same calm confidence, he walked up again. "This one's fun," he said. "It reminds me of something I worked on in college." He began writing, breaking down the proof step by step, citing theorems with a casual ease that made some students scramble to keep up in their notes. As Musk concluded, Whitman felt his stomach tighten. There were no errors. Worse yet, Musk had provided a more intuitive explanation than he himself might have. The students weren't just impressed, they were awestruck. A hand shot up from the back of the room. A student, clearly inspired, asked, "Mr. Musk, how do you approach complex problems like these in real life?" Musk smiled. "I break them down. Math, physics, engineering. It's all about understanding the fundamentals first. Once you get those, even the hardest problems start to look solvable." He turned to Whitman, his expression friendly but knowing. "That's why I always tell people, never assume someone isn't capable just because they don't have the same title as you." The message was clear. The students nodded, some even grinning. Professor Whitman forced a tight smile. He had tried to expose Musk as an intellectual fraud, only to expose his own assumptions instead. As the class ended, Musk gave a casual wave and left, his lesson not just in calculus, but in humility. Whitman, meanwhile, stood silently by the board, staring at the flawless solutions, knowing that today he had been outclassed. As the students filed out, the buzz of conversation filled the lecture hall. Some whispered about Musk's brilliance, while others laughed at the irony of the situation. Whitman remained by the board, staring at the chalk-dusted surface as if it held the answer to how he had lost control of his own classroom. He had spent decades refining his understanding of mathematics, lecturing on its beauty and complexity, yet Musk had walked in and dismantled his authority with ease. It wasn't just that Musk had solved the problems, it was how effortlessly he had done it. And worse, he had done it with charm. The students admired him, not just for his intelligence, but for the confidence and humility with which he carried it. A knock at the desk snapped Whitman from his thoughts. A young student, glasses perched on the edge of his nose, hesitated before speaking. "Professor, do you think intelligence is something you're born with or something you build?" Whitman adjusted his glasses, considering the question. Before today, he might have answered differently. He had always believed in the academic hierarchy, credentials, research papers, peer-reviewed journals. But Musk had just demonstrated something that Whitman had overlooked. Intelligence wasn't just about theory. It was about application, adaptability, and curiosity. "I suppose," Whitman said slowly, "it's both. You can be born with potential, but if you don't nurture it, it doesn't mean much." The student nodded, then hesitated. "Musk, he never finished his PhD, right?" Whitman exhaled sharply through his nose. "No, he didn't." The student grinned. "Guess that doesn't matter as much as I thought." With that, the student walked off, leaving Whitman alone in the empty lecture hall. He turned back to the board, rubbing his chin. Maybe he had been too quick to judge. Maybe intelligence wasn't just confined to academia. For the first time in years, Professor Whitman felt something he hadn't felt in a long while: curiosity. Maybe it was time to start looking at intelligence a little differently. That evening, Professor Whitman sat in his dimly lit office, staring at his bookshelf lined with textbooks on advanced mathematics, real analysis, and theoretical physics. Normally, he found comfort in these volumes, each representing a lifetime of study and intellectual rigor, but tonight they felt insufficient. His ego had taken a hit, there was no denying that. Musk had walked into his domain and bested him without breaking a sweat. But beyond the embarrassment, Whitman couldn't shake a deeper feeling. One he rarely experienced. It wasn't anger or resentment, it was admiration. Reluctantly, he pulled up his computer and searched for Musk's academic background. He already knew the basics, studied at Queen's University, transferred to Penn, double majored in physics and economics, no PhD, no formal credentials beyond his bachelor's degree, and yet he had designed rockets, revolutionized electric vehicles, and created innovations across multiple industries. Whitman leaned back, rubbing his temples. His entire career, he had viewed academia as the pinnacle of intelligence. But Musk had just demonstrated something far more valuable: practical intelligence, the ability to bridge theory with real-world execution. With a sigh, Whitman clicked on a video interview where Musk explained how he had taught himself rocket science. "You read textbooks, you study the fundamentals, and then you apply them," Musk said. "You don't need someone to hand you a degree to figure things out." The words struck Whitman harder than he expected. He had spent years lecturing students on mathematical concepts, but how often had he encouraged them to go beyond the classroom? How often had he emphasized real-world application over theoretical perfection? A soft knock at his office door pulled him from his thoughts. It was the same student from earlier, the one who had asked about intelligence. "Professor," the student said hesitantly, "I just wanted to say, today's class was probably the most interesting one we've had." Whitman raised an eyebrow. "Because of Musk?" The student nodded. "Yeah, but not just because he's smart. It's because he made math feel alive. Like it wasn't just numbers on a board, but something you could use to build things, change things." I guess I never thought about it that way before. Whitman studied the student for a moment before exhaling. Neither did I, he admitted. The student grinned. Well, maybe you should invite more people like him. Whitman chuckled, shaking his head. We'll see. As the student left, Whitman turned back to his bookshelf, eyeing the textbooks with a newfound perspective. Maybe, just maybe, it was time to rethink what it really meant to be a teacher. The next morning, Professor Whitman arrived at his lecture hall earlier than usual. The room was empty, silent, save for the faint hum of the overhead lights. He stood at the front, hands in his pockets, staring at the board where Musk had effortlessly solved his toughest equations the day before. For years, Whitman had taken pride in being the gatekeeper of knowledge, the one who determined who was truly brilliant and who wasn't. But Musk had shown him that intelligence wasn't something to be confined to ivory towers and research papers. It was something fluid, adaptable, and most importantly, practical. The door creaked open, and a few early students trickled in, chatting among themselves. Some carried an energy he hadn't seen before, as if yesterday's encounter had ignited something in them. One of his brightest students, Lisa, dropped her bag onto a desk and approached him. Professor, I was thinking about what Musk said yesterday, about breaking problems down. She hesitated, then continued. I've been struggling with a project in my engineering course, and I was wondering, could you help me look at it differently? Whitman blinked. Normally, he would have directed her to the textbook or a peer-reviewed paper, but something stopped him. Instead, he nodded. Tell me about it. As she explained her project, something involving optimizing fluid dynamics for a new type of turbine, Whitman listened, really listened. Instead of jumping to abstract theory, he thought about how Musk had approached problems. Fundamentals first, then application. All right, he said finally, grabbing a piece of chalk. Let's break this down step by step. Lisa's face lit up with excitement as they worked through the problem together. Other students, noticing their discussion, gathered around, throwing in their own ideas. The classroom, usually quiet and orderly before the lecture, became a space of vibrant conversation and curiosity. For the first time in a long while, Whitman felt something he hadn't felt since he was a young student himself, genuine excitement for discovery. As the room filled with more students, he made a decision. Today's lesson wouldn't just be another theoretical lecture. He would challenge his students not just to memorize, but to apply, to think, to build, to innovate. Maybe Elon Musk had walked into his class to be tested, but in the end it was Whitman who had been schooled. And for that, he was unexpectedly grateful. The following weeks in Professor Whitman's class were unlike any before. The usual rigid structure of lectures and problem sets gave way to more open discussions, real-world applications, and problem-solving challenges that forced students to think beyond equations and proofs. One afternoon, as he was preparing for class, an email popped up in his inbox. The sender, Elon Musk. Whitman's pulse quickened as he clicked on it. Subject: Cool class. Keep it up. Professor Whitman just wanted to say yesterday's lecture was fun. You've got some sharp students. If any of them are interested in applying math to real-world engineering, send them my way. Cheers. Elon Whitman leaned back in his chair, staring at the email. It wasn't long or elaborate, but it carried weight. It wasn't every day that a billionaire tech mogul offered to take students under his wing. He glanced out the window, watching the campus buzz with students heading to their next classes. A thought crossed his mind. What if his role wasn't just to teach math, but to inspire the next generation of problem solvers? Not just to prepare them for exams, but to push them toward real impact? The bell rang, signaling the start of his lecture. He shut his laptop, grabbed a piece of chalk, and walked into the classroom with a new energy. As the students settled in, he turned to the board and wrote in bold letters, "Mathematics in the real world, thinking like an innovator." He turned back to the class. "All right," he said, a small smirk forming. "Let's try something different today." The students leaned forward, intrigued. Whitman felt something shift within himself. For the first time in his career, he wasn't just a professor. He was a guide into a bigger world of possibilities. And that, he realized, was the kind of educator he had always wanted to be. As the semester progressed, Professor Whitman's class transformed. What had once been a rigid environment of proofs and derivations became an incubator for curiosity. Students who had once seen calculus as a chore now debated real-world applications with enthusiasm. One afternoon, as he wrapped up a lecture on differential equations in orbital mechanics, a student raised her hand. "Professor, do you think someone like us could actually work on space tech? I mean, without a PhD or years of experience?" Whitman paused. A month ago, his answer would have been a lecture on the importance of advanced degrees, the necessity of peer-reviewed research. But now, he thought about Musk, the man who had dropped out of a PhD program yet managed to land rockets. "I think," Whitman said slowly, "if you understand the fundamentals and you're willing to apply them, creatively you can go further than you ever imagined." The student nodded, looking thoughtful. Another hand shot up. "So, if I wanted to build something, where would I start?" Whitman smiled. "Funny you should ask. I was actually thinking of assigning something a little different." Murmurs spread through the room. "For your final project," he continued, "I want you to take a mathematical concept we've studied and apply it to a real-world problem. It can be engineering, finance, medicine, anything. You'll work in teams, and at the end of the semester, you'll present your findings." A few students exchanged excited glances. One student, usually quiet in the back row, raised a hand. "Can we build something? Like an actual prototype?" Whitman grinned. "If you can make the math work, then by all means build away." From that moment on, the classroom buzzed with energy. Teams formed, ideas flew, and what had once been a lecture-based course turned into something far greater, a lab for innovation. A few weeks later, another email arrived. This time it wasn't from Musk, it was from SpaceX's internship department. Subject: "Interested in your students, Professor Whitman. Elon mentioned that you have some bright students working on real-world applications of math. If any of them are interested in internships or research opportunities, let us know. We're always looking for problem solvers." Whitman exhaled, shaking his head in disbelief. A challenge that had started as an attempt to humiliate Musk had turned into something far more meaningful. His students weren't just learning calculus anymore. They were preparing to change the world. As he closed his laptop, he looked out at his students, deep in discussion over their projects. A sense of pride swelled in his chest. Perhaps the greatest lesson he had ever taught wasn't from a textbook. Perhaps, just perhaps, it had been the one Elon Musk had taught him. As the semester neared its end, the excitement in Professor Whitman's classroom reached new heights. The final projects had taken on a life of their own. What started as a simple assignment had evolved into something much bigger. One team was using calculus to optimize the aerodynamics of a drone. Another was working on an algorithm to predict financial market trends using differential equations. One ambitious group was even designing a small-scale propulsion system, inspired by Musk's work with SpaceX. Whitman watched with a mix of pride and astonishment. These weren't just theoretical exercises. His students were applying advanced mathematics to solve real-world problems, something he had never truly encouraged before. One evening, as he reviewed their progress reports in his office, his phone buzzed. Another email. This one was short and to the point, from Elon Musk. Subject: "Keep pushing. Saw the projects your students are working on. Impressive stuff. Keep pushing them. The world needs more minds like these." Whitman stared at the screen, exhaling slowly. A month ago, he had tried to put Musk in his place. Now he was unintentionally shaping the kind of students that companies like SpaceX, Tesla, and Neuralink would want. The day of the final presentations arrived. The lecture hall was packed, not just with students but with faculty members, engineers, from local tech firms, and even a few venture capitalists who had caught wind of the students' work. One by one, the teams presented. The drone project showcased a live demonstration. The finance team displayed models predicting stock fluctuations with startling accuracy. The propulsion group? They had built a working prototype, and though small, it functioned exactly as intended. When the last team wrapped up, the room erupted into applause. Whitman stood at the front, scanning the faces of his students. They weren't just learning math anymore, they were using it to create. As the applause settled, he cleared his throat. "This," he said, gesturing to the room, "is what education should be. Not just memorizing formulas, not just passing exams, it should be about solving problems that matter." A moment of silence. Then, a voice from the back.